The next reflection on the East Asian way of war takes us to a book I wrote in response to all of this, The Dog Barking, that I mentioned in the previous episode, and what I drew, lessons I drew from it. And this led to this book. The Philosophy of Japanese Wartime Resistance. And this unites my work on what I call the failure, as a question, of liberal Asian studies to grasp the precise nature of Japanese politics during the Pacific War, or the Great East Asian War, if you will. And then, having done that, to piece it together with Confucian Revolution. So you have two interpretive frameworks coming together to explain things which are dense and resistant to understanding, but having got some purchase on, you can make some sense of it. Now, philosophy of Japanese religion, the philosophy of Japanese wartime resistance, carried an elaborate subtitle, a reading with commentary of the complete text of the Kyoto School discussions of the standpoint of world history in Japan. These were wartime texts, published in Chuo Koren, the Japanese intellectual journal. And they were among the most controversial, most interesting, most read of these texts until the army authorities said they would have no more of this, and they closed down Chuo Koren. So that was the end of that. And the Kyoto school became more circumspect, although continued to be forthright until the death of its leading figures, naturally, and then silenced, and then returned or not returned, depending on the wartime, post-war circumstances. Now, this book took me to a different, but the same place, a version of the same place, and this will give you an idea. The Japanese, the interwar Japan, and the interwar Japan circumstances requires the closest of attention to understand. There are, in effect, in the Japanese mind, of the elite certainly, 3 clocks ticking down, 3 alarms, if you will, ticking down, at the same time. One is the steady emergence of American power, what I call liberal imperialism. Woodrow Wilson's is the key figure here, although American imperialists are legion at this point. But his notion was that it was liberal, it was moral, that you transform the world by improving it, by conquering. That's an important rubric. That's one. Secondly, the Japanese were even more mindful of whatever they were thought about American power. The real problem was China. China had gone through a very bad period. 1911, the Qin dynasty had fallen, the Manchus had lost control, and China had set adrift into a civil war, which was not resolved until 1949 with the victory of the communists, Mao Zedong. So during this whole period, the Japanese know this dance of civil war strife, bandits and warlords and what happened, that was aimed at something, that was going to end in a new regime. And if the regime qualified as the real deal in terms of dynastic succession, even though called a republic, then this, because China is so important in the region, so overwhelmingly the greatest power, much like the United States is in the New World context, then the Japanese had to get their house in order as best they could before this arrived. So Wilson on the march with American power, outreach. Despite isolationism, continued to outreach. Then we have the problem of China, the ticking clock there, the giant awakening, to use Napoleon's quip. Then there was the third issue. And this was the internal constitutional organization of Japanese political life. With the death of the Emperor Meiji, the Meiji dispensation that had begun with the end of the Tokugawa in 1868, that whole period, it didn't suddenly end, but it was called into question. I mean, the mandate was not clear. People attempted to assume it, attempted to make something of it. Taisho democracy was an attempt to do this in a Western liberal way, Wilson's shadow, and it failed. It was battered to death, if you will. So the army, the navy, factions of the army, extreme right, moderate right, struggle to establish a new regime, to establish a new mandate of heaven, which in my view had lapsed in 1912 effectively, if not nominally, not formally, but effectively had lapsed, and was not found again until the Tojo cabinet of October 1941, which took form, and then we had a new mandate. You see, again, thinking about my colleagues, they just go hysterical with this notion that the Tojo government was legitimate, but in Confucian terms it was. Power makes right in Confucianism. So, having done that, the question was the mechanism by which this was established, and what happened after it was established to Japanese elite conservative thinking. And that took us to the Chuo-Koron Japan, the standpoint of Japan in history. What we were going to make of that, the Hegelian framework there, beyond the end of history, you see the end of history again. We're looking at that sort of thing. What is Japan's place in world history? Hegel's question. These are Hegelians, these people, like me. So having done that, the first dialogue was conducted before Pearl Harbor, and the other two were later, one almost simultaneous at the same time as the fall of the Dutch East Indies, and the third was not long, at about the same time, the Battle of Midway. So these are strategic moments in Japanese, in the conflict, the Pacific War, if you will. And this is reflected in the dialogues. The dialogues are extraordinary. It was a great deal of fun to do the research on them and get a proper understanding of them, given that most Japanese didn't approve. I had a wonderful moment when I went into one of the finest used bookstores in Koenji. I mean, outstanding, intellectually serious. I mean, I've hardly ever been in an American equivalent of it. And I asked about Tanabe Hajime, and the guy sort of knew. When I asked about some of his colleagues, the guy had, who are they? So I was digging out stuff that even well-educated Japanese weren't familiar with. And I think partly because of the taboo. And of course, the texts themselves have been buried inside a desk that I think the grandson of the author would use to do homework on. And until he opened up the desk at the insistence of a Japanese researcher, and they discovered the manuscript for these dialogues, these discussions, then the whole thing would have been lost sight of. But having found them in this wonderful history needed to be told, and then I translated them and commented on them because they needed commentary. So this was the way I arrived from Paul Moose via Francis Fitzgerald to my understanding via the dog barking about Confucian Revolution, how it works in all circumstances. Now let's broadly zoom out here just for a minute and see what I'm saying. Between 1912 and 1941, the Japanese struggled to arrive at a successful Confucian Revolution outcome, in other words, a stable, robust, vigorous regime. The Chinese struggled from 1911 to 1949 to do the same. The Vietnamese effectively struggled. I mean, French colonial rule was legitimate. This again, my colleagues found that colonialism was legitimate and Confucianized. Confucianism is colorblind. The American sovereignty over Japan, the French sovereignty over Indochina was legitimate. Confucianism is colorblind. How could it be otherwise when you have foreign dynasties ruling China? The Mongols were not Chinese, and they ruled legitimately. We have to get our head around this. So given that, when March 1945, as I mentioned, the Japanese seized control, at that moment the French mandate lapsed. The Japanese attempted to assume it, but by March, from March till April, March till August, and the Japanese collapsed to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the whole bit. Then Ho Chi Minh made his move to occupy Hanoi and proclaim the Republic of Vietnam, I think him standing in front of the Opera House in Hanoi. And then the struggle for revolution began. From 1945 to 1975, the Vietnamese struggled to establish, to sustain, to win a successful Confucian Revolution, which they did. And in 1945, with the fall of Saigon, a Confucian Revolution was successful. So, Peking, Beijing falling in 1949 was the mark of the Chinese arriving at a successful Confucian Revolution. 1945, with the surrender, with the Emperor's statement, of surrender, the radio one, the famous one, that marked the end of the Tojo regime and the arrival of American sovereignty, in effect, de facto. North Korea, if the North had succeeded in overrunning the South and the United States had not intervened, then that would have resolved their problem, post-independence from Japan, 1945 until 1950. But the United States and the United Nations intervened, and so that didn't happen, and now they still hasn't been resolved. Someday it will be. Korea will be united. That Confucian urge will not go away. Then, and this brings us to the point, well, Cambodia is another whole story which I've talked about. But the really interesting thing is that the Republic of China, the old Republican regime, which the communists defeated, drove off the mainland, withdrew to Taiwan, fortified it, made it their own. And as I've said earlier, Taiwan is not Taiwan. Taiwan is the Republic of China. Republic of China, by the very name, has a claim to be the legitimate rulers of all China. And this is why Beijing, the People's Republic, is so keen to extinguish this. Again, the thought is lost on so many. It's not occupying Taiwan as such, however desirable from the Chinese point of view. It's eliminating the substantive claim of the People's Republic, not the People's Republic of China. Now, to make this even more dazzling, you can see the reverse effect. If the United States is forced to put troops and boots on the ground in China in order to defeat the People's Republic, it will be intervening once again in a Confucian civil war. China, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, all civil wars. Now another one. And our wisest war aim would be to restore the Republic of China. Has anyone given any consideration of this possibility in Washington? And if not, why not? Who's minding the store? And with that little remark, we'll leave it. But this is where we're going with this. If you want to understand the East Asian way of war, and that's certainly how I understand it, this is an approach. It may not be the best approach, it may not be the only approach, but it'll have to do until we have something better. And there we'll leave it until the next episode.